vast multiverse. Mr. Strange.
Welcome back, Screen Crush. I'm Ryan Airy. So Spider-Man No Way Home deals with the multiverse, and whether you've seen the movie or you're about to see it, we thought you could use an explainer on how the multiverse works. Now, of course, the multiverse is a huge part of Spider-Man No Way Home storyline, but this isn't the first time we've seen the multiverse in the MCU, and it's not going to be the last. The Disney Plus series Loki dives deep into the multiverse, and I actually highly recommend you watch it before you see No Way Home. But if you don't have time to watch the show before seeing the movie, you've come to the right video store. Let's start by explaining the terminology, timelines, and universes. Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy is its own universe. We don't have to wonder why Henry Cavill's Superman doesn't come in to save the day in those films, because in that universe, as far as we know, they don't have a Superman. Sticking with Batman, Michael Keaton's Batman is in a separate universe than Christian Bale's Batman. So while yes, they're both Batman, we as the audience understand that they're different characters with their own storylines and their own worlds that are not connected, I guess until Flashpoint.
That's not important right now.
Now let's talk timelines. Fox's X-Men franchise is a great example of a set of films that share a common universe, but then splinter off into different timelines, thus creating new universes. We see sequels in these respective franchises that consider past films canon, but don't consider each other canon. Let me explain. For example, X-Men First Class is canon to both X-Men timelines, but X-Men Last Stand and X-Men Apocalypse are not canon to each other. This is because the original X-Men timeline was changed after the movie Days of the Future Past.
Logan, is everything all right?
Yeah.
And Wolverine is the only one who remembers that old timeline. By the rules of the MCU, the creation of this new timeline also created a new universe. In Avengers Endgame, the Avengers tampered with reality when they traveled back in time. Now, their interactions in the past created timelines that splintered off from their original timeline. So, why does time traveling make a new universe instead of altering the past? Well, Dr. Banner does a pretty good job of explaining it.
Changing the past doesn't change the future. If you travel to the past, that past becomes your future. And your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future.
Exactly.
Now, the movie does end with Steve Rogers returning the stones to their realities, but this doesn't prevent these tangent realities from existing. The stones are returned because they are needed to keep the dark forces of the universe at bay in those new realities that the Avengers have created.
Without our chief weapon against the forces of darkness, our world would be overrun. Millions will suffer.
For instance, without the Time Stone, Strange couldn't stop Dormammu.
This is time.
The TV show What If showed us that there are already multiple realities that have nothing to do with time travel. We see multiple versions of different characters whose lives are changed by minor and major decisions.
Where a single choice can branch out into infinite realities.
All of these universes are different realities, different timelines, and they help make up the Marvel Multiverse. In Loki, we learned that these alternate versions of characters are actually called variants. Okay, so what's a variant? A variant is, well, a variant of the same individual from another universe.
I mean, they got the same shit over there that they got here, but it's just there, it's a little different.
In the show Loki, he meets other versions of himself from different timelines, or other universes, if you will. The terms timelines and universes are basically interchangeable. You do have these separate universes, but as those universes splinter off into different timelines, those timelines in themselves become alternate universes. So theoretically, you could track 100 different universes back to one single universe that they all stemmed from. It's also important to mention that in the Loki series, we see Loki meet versions of himself that look and sound exactly like him. But he also meets versions that look nothing like him, such as different races, different sexes, and even different species. When you first start watching Loki, you're given the impression that the multiverse has been erased and there is only one sacred timeline.
But then the all-knowing timekeepers emerged, bringing peace by reorganizing the multiverse into a single timeline.
Miss Minutes tells us that anytime someone does something as minor as being late to work, it means they've stepped off their predetermined path, resulting in a new timeline with a world of new variants. That is when the TVA, which is short for Time Variance Authority, they step in, capture the variant, and erase that timeline back to that splitting point. The first time we meet the TVA is in Loki episode 1. This is right after Loki escapes with the Tesseract in Endgame. Now this event is flagged by the TVA because they monitor splintering timelines. Then they jump into action to stop the branch before it becomes permanent. This is where we see Loki arrested by the TVA, and then that branch reality is erased, or as the TVA calls it, pruned, with these reset charges. This results in that timeline being erased back to that splitting point. When Loki arrives at the TVA, we're shown a video discussing the sacred timeline, a multiversal war, and the timekeepers, all narrated by Miss Minutes.
There was a vast multiversal war. Countless unique timelines battled each other for supremacy, nearly resulting in the total destruction of, well, everything.
The gist of the video is the sacred timeline is maintained to prevent a multiversal war from occurring. But just so we're clear, the sacred timeline is actually composed of several other timelines or many different universes. Think of it like the individual strands of a rope, creating one single sacred timeline. The series ends with the reveal that there are no timekeepers and the TVA is actually under the control of a scientist from Earth's future. This scientist discovered the multiverse and met his other counterparts that were in other timelines. But eventually, one of those counterparts decided to conquer all of the multiverse, became Kang the Conqueror, and kicked off the multiversal war that Miss Minutes talked about. So, one of Kang's variants, a guy called He Who Remains, created the TVA to prevent his alternate universe selves from ever existing, thus preventing the great multiversal war. Now, remember that rope metaphor? Each of those strands are a separate universe that is allowed to exist because it won't lead to this multiversal war. For instance, the Avengers created multiple realities when they went time hopping, including one where Hydra thought that Steve Rogers knew they existed. But those realities that are very different from the original timeline are allowed to exist because they do not create Kang the Conqueror. Now, with He Who Remains determining what can and can't happen in order for the multiverse to survive, this introduces the idea of absolutes. There are certain events in every timeline or universe that must happen. If they don't happen, it will lead to a future with Kang the Conqueror wreaking havoc throughout the multiverse. One of those absolutes seems to be that all Lokis must be bad up until the events of Ragnarok, where they die at the hands of Thanos.
That's the proper flow of time, and it happens again and again and again because it's supposed to, because it has to.
So you can have a Loki that is born an alligator or born a girl, but as we see here, this Loki variant, Sylvie, is playing with Valkyrie dolls and maybe decides to be a hero when she grows up. This would alter the timeline too much, so the TVA steps in to arrest her. This is not allowed in the sacred timeline because it will lead to an evil Kang variant. Now, how does all this tie into Spider-Man No Way Home? Well, with it being very, very likely we're going to see Tobey and Andrew's Spider-Man in No Way Home, that will mean that their Peter Parkers, along with Tom Holland's Peter Parker, are all variants of one another. And that will mean that their universes are likely universes that were approved timelines within the sacred timeline. Because apparently this event, while horrible to look at, did not create Kang the Conqueror. And as the Loki series shows us, all these variants can look different, sound different, be different ages, be played by different actors. I mean, the possibilities are nearly endless. In one of our previous videos, we theorized that the villains in No Way Home are actually variants. And we noticed in the comments section that there's a lot of confusion over what it means to be a variant. There are multiple versions of everyone throughout the multiverse, and no single person is necessarily the original. And every universe does not necessarily have to have a variant of someone who exists in another universe. As long as an individual existing or not existing doesn't lead to a multiversal war, then the TVA doesn't care. Now, it's also worth mentioning that the other Spider universes could have been created at the end of Loki. So, spoiler alert for that show. At the end of the show Loki, Sylvie kills He Who Remains, resulting in the deconstruction of the sacred timeline. This allows the new universes / timelines that don't abide by the sacred timeline rules to come into existence. We see trillions of new timelines / universes splintering out of the contained circular sacred timeline. These universes create realities very different from what He Who Remains intended. So not only does this create Kang the Conqueror, but it might also allow the universes of other movie franchises to enter the MCU. The other Spider-Man franchises, the X-Men films, Deadpool, Fantastic. But before we go, I want to touch on one last thing. In Loki, we see the multiverse seemingly going into madness, setting us up for No Way Home and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. But in No Way Home, it's clear that Strange's spell is what causes the multiverse chaos that we're seeing in this film. It's beginning to look like the death of He Who Remains and the expansion of the multiverse is what's allowing the events of No Way Home to even take place. The world finding out that Peter Parker Spider-Man may not have even been part of the sacred timeline, but due to the events at the end of Loki, we may have entered a splintered universe whose history is everything we've experienced so far. But from now on is going to be a very different path where chaotic things are happening due to no oversight by He Who Remains. But that's just what we think. Let us know your thoughts and comments or questions down in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe and smash that bell. For Screen Crush, I'm Ryan Airy.